Good morning, friends. When we go back to the parable of the unforgiven servant from Matthew 18, we see the obvious point that the servant should have been merciful to his fellow servant since he himself received such incredible mercy from their mutual master. He had owed the master 10,000 talents, which we saw was a sum of money basically beyond reckoning, an amount he could never repay. We ballparked it at some 200,000 years worth of annual salary, all lumped together in one massive debt. And of course, the point isn't really about identifying a specific dollar amount, but just conveying that truth that this was a crushing and hopeless debt that he owed. And yet his master, out of just pure mercy, forgave him all of that incredible debt. And so when this freshly forgiven servant went to his fellow servant who owed him a much smaller debt, equivalent to roughly 3 months of salary, the servant really should have been merciful, even as the master had been merciful to him. As we reference R.C. Sproul's commentary on this, that first servant should have managed the master's grace far better than he managed the master's money. But unfortunately, he did not. Instead of conveying that same mercy to his fellow servant, he had no mercy whatsoever and ended up having his fellow servant essentially thrown into debtor's prison until that smaller debt could be paid off. And of course, the master found out and condemned the first servant for this incredibly wicked act in light of the mercy that he himself had received. And with that all in mind, I'd like to point out a simple truth that might easily be missed in the midst of all this. And that is that the debt that the second servant owed the first servant, that 3 months salary, that's no small amount of money. That's not actually a small debt. Now, obviously, compared to 200,000 years worth of salary, it's completely inconsequential. But if we just look at it as it is, not trying to compare it to anything else, what that second servant owed the first really is a lot of money. That's a big debt. If I owed a friend or a coworker the equivalent of 3 months' pay, I'd really feel the weight of that debt hanging over my head. And my point is that the 10,000 talents that the first servant owed the king is comparable to the debt of sin we owe to God, or the debt from the sin that's caused by our sin that we owe to God. And the debt of 100 denarii, or 3 months' pay, is comparable to the debt that we often owe each other when we sin against each other. And it's worth comparing the size of those debts. The debt we owe God, like the one in the parable, is crushing and leaves us with no hope of ever repaying. And in comparison to that debt, the debt we owe one another is practically inconsequential. But the point I'd like to emphasize today is that if we simply look at the idea of the debt, the size of the 3 months' wages, as put forth in the illustration, the debt that we owe to each other, that it's nothing compared to the eternal debt. But in terms of just living life on this earth, it's really no small thing. It's significant. And therefore, the idea that we shouldn't act as if it's no big deal when we do sin against one another, when we hurt one another, when we do things that bring damage to our relationships, that break down trust and hinder our fellowship. Those are no small things. Just like owing or being owed the equivalent of 3 months' pay is a big deal, it's a big deal when we sin against one another. And really this morning, I just want to acknowledge that, because sometimes we might be tempted to teach this parable of the unforgiven servant in a way that concludes that since God so graciously and so completely forgave us of our incredible debt, that when the command comes to forgive one another, it ought to be easy for us to do. God forgave us so much and our fellow Christian owes us so little in comparison, then it's an easy matter to forgive one another, right? But no, that's not always the case. Let's be realistic about this, because the hurt we cause one another is real. The breakdown of relationships is real, which is why, of course, we need reconciliation and restoration, which requires that forgiveness that we're talking about. But even as we do so, let's acknowledge the fact that we really can struggle to grant that forgiveness. Because again, the pain is real. The struggle with bitterness, with vindictiveness, with anger, it's all real. And that's when we do need to take a look at the debt that we owed God, that he forgave so mercifully. Because when we struggle with forgiving someone, and let's say a neutral, bystander sees that struggle, and they come to us and they try to encourage us, hey, just let it go. It's all water under the bridge. Just forgive it and forget it and just move on. Well, sometimes the retort comes, but you don't understand what they did to me. You don't understand the pain I'm experiencing. And so again, I want to take this opportunity this morning, brother, sister, as best I can, especially just kind of addressing you all generally. I still want to acknowledge the significance of what has happened, to acknowledge the pain you have received on account of it. It wasn't a small, inconsequential, easily brushed off thing when that person that you loved and have a relationship with, that other brother or sister of Christ, when they sinned against you. It caused real hurt, real pain, real trauma, doubt, anxiety, or anger in your life. I want to acknowledge that. And yet also acknowledge the truth that we are indeed called to be merciful toward them. Why? Because God was indeed merciful to us. And even though we may not want to admit it, we may not want to think of it in these terms, the truth is that no matter what that other person did to us, which absolutely can include some pretty heinous things, but no matter what that other person did to us, it is true that the debt they owe us will never compare to the debt that we owed to God. Because our debt toward God required his own beloved, only begotten Son to experience the very essence of hell, God's own wrath, to pay it. And no matter what that other person did to you or to me, they betrayed you, hurt your family, beat your dog, burned down your house. Even so, the debt they owe us for anything like that still does not compare with the debt we owed God on account of our defiance toward him through sin. And so we do sort of end up right back at the original conclusion. It's true, we forgive others because God forgave us, not in a legalistic sense, but in a, wow, what has God done for me? Look at the extent of mercy he has given to me. And so we must forgive one another, no matter what. But I do want to say that in full acknowledgement that this doesn't mean actually doing that forgiveness. It doesn't mean that it instantly becomes easy. It doesn't necessarily. It can still be incredibly difficult to forgive. But we can and should seek God's strength, asking him for his grace and mercy to be present in us, so that we truly can forgive our brothers and sisters fully and genuinely, so that we can be reconciled one to another as fellow servants of the same master. May this be our desire, to persevere, to strive, to forgive one another, to bear with one another, and to offer that forgiveness, that reconciliation, so that we can be perfectly united in the love of our mutual master. I love you guys. Please think this over. Have a good and godly day. And Lord willing, I'll see you soon.